Day 2. The third story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tonight's recording by Miette. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 2, the third story. 3 young men squander their substance and are reduced to poverty. Their nephew, returning home a desperate man, falls in with an abbot, in whom he discovers the daughter of the King of England. She marries him, and he retrieves the losses, and re-establishes the fortunes of his uncles.
The ladies marvelled to hear the adventures of Rinaldo d'Asti, praised his devotion, and gave thanks to God and Saint Julian for the succour lent him in his extreme need. Nor though the verdict was hardly outspoken, was the lady deemed unwise to take the boon which God hath sent her. So they chattered and talked of her night of delight, while Pompineia, being seated by Philostrato, and surmising that her turn would, as it did, come next, was lost in meditation on what she was to say. Roused from her reverie by the word of the Queen, she put on a cheerful courage, and thus began.
Noble ladies, discourse as we may of fortune's handiwork, much still remains to be said, if we but scan events aright. Nor need we marvel thereat, if we but duly consider that all matters, which we foolishly call our own, are in her hands, and therefore subject at her inscrutable will to every variety of chance and change without any order therein by us discernible, which is indeed signally manifest everywhere and all day long, yet as 'tis our Queen's will that we speak thereof, perhaps 'twill not be unprofitable to you, if, notwithstanding it has been the theme of some of the foregoing stories, I add to them another, which I believe should give you pleasure. There was formerly in our city a knight, by name Messer Tebaldo, of the Lamberti, according to some, or, as others say, of the Agolanti family, perhaps for no other better reason than that the occupation of his sons was similar to that which always was, and is the occupation of the Agolanti. However, without professing to determine which of the two houses he belonged to, I say that he was in his day a very wealthy knight, and had 3 sons, the eldest being by name Lamberto, the second Tebaldo, and the third Agolante. Fine, spirited young men were they all, though the eldest was not yet 18 years old when their father, Messer Tebaldo, died, very rich, leaving to them as his lawful heirs the whole of his property, both movable and immovable. Finding themselves thus possessed of great wealth, both in money and in lands and chattels, they fell to spending without stint or restraint, indulging their every desire, maintaining a great establishment, and a large and well-filled stable, besides dogs and hawks, keeping their open house, scattering largesses, jousting, and not content with these and the like pastimes proper to their condition, indulging every appetite natural to their youth. They had not long followed this course of life before the cash left them by their father was exhausted, and, their rents not sufficing to defray their expenditure, they began to sell and pledge their property, and, disposing of it by degrees, one item today and another tomorrow, they hardly perceived that they were approaching the verge of ruin, until poverty opened the eyes which wealth had fast sealed. So, one day Lamberto called his brothers to him, reminded them of the position of wealth and dignity which had been theirs and their fathers before them, and shewed them the poverty to which their extravagance had reduced them, and adjured them most earnestly that, before their destitution was yet further manifest, they should all three sell what little remained to them and depart thence, which, accordingly, they did. Without leave-taking or any ceremony, they quitted Florence. Nor did they rest until they had arrived in England and established themselves in a small house in London, where, by living with extreme parsimony and lending at exorbitant usances, they prospered so well that in the course of a few years they amassed a fortune. And so, one by one, they returned to Florence, purchased not a few of their former estates besides many others, and married. The management of their affairs in England, where they continued their business as usurers, they left to a young nephew, Alessandro by name, while, heedless alike of the teaching of experience and of marital and parental duty, they all three launched out at Florence into more extravagant expenditure than before, and contracted debts on all hands and to large amounts. This expenditure they were enabled for some years to support by the remittances made by Alessandro, who, to his great profit, had lent money to the barons of the security of their castles and rents. While the three brothers thus continued to spend freely, and, when short of money, to borrow it, never doubting of help from England, it so happened that, to the surprise of everybody, there broke out in England a war between the king and his son, by which the whole island was divided into two camps, whereby Alessandro lost all his mortgages of the baronial castles and every other source of income whatsoever. However, in the daily expectation that peace would be concluded between the king and his son, Alessandro, hoping that in that event all would be restored to him, principal and interest, tarried in the island, and the three brothers at Florence in no degree retrenched their extravagant expenditure, but went on borrowing from day to day. Several years thus passed, and, their hopes being frustrated, the three brothers not only lost credit, but, being pressed for payment by their creditors, were suddenly arrested, and, their property proving deficient, were kept in prison for the balance, while their wives and little children went into the country parts, or elsewhere, wretchedly equipped, and with no other prospect than to pass the rest of their days in destitution. Alessandro, meanwhile, seeing that the peace which he had for several years awaited in England did not come, and deeming that he would hazard his life to no purpose by tarrying longer in the country, made up his mind to return to Italy. He travelled at first altogether alone, but it so chanced that he left Bruges at the same time with an abbot, habited in white, attended by a numerous retinue, and preceded by a goodly baggage train. Behind the abbot rode two grey-bearded knights, kinsmen of the king, in whom Alessandro recognized acquaintances, and, making himself known to them, was readily received into their company. As thus they journeyed together, Alessandro softly asked them who the monks were that rode in front with so great a train, and whither they were bound. "The foremost rider," replied one of the knights, "is a young kinsman of ours, the newly elected abbot of one of the greatest abbeys of England, and as he is not of legal age for such a dignity, we are going with him to Rome to obtain the Holy Father's dispensation and his confirmation in the office. But this is not a matter for common talk." Now, the new abbot, as lords are wont to do when they travel, was sometimes in front, sometimes in rear of his train, and thus it happened that, as he passed, he set eyes on Alessandro, who was still quite young, and very shapely and well-favoured, and as courteous, gracious, and debonair as e'er another. The abbot was marvellously taken with him at first sight, having never seen aught that pleased him so much, called him to his side, addressed him graciously, and asked who he was, whence he came, and whither he was bound. Alessandro frankly told all about himself, and having thus answered the abbot's questions, placed himself at his service as far as his small ability might extend. The abbot was struck by his easy flow of apt speech, and observing his bearing more closely, he made up his mind that, albeit his occupation was base, he was nevertheless of gentle blood, which added no little to his interest in him, and being moved to compassion by his misfortunes, he gave him friendly consolation, bidding him be of good hope, that if he lived a worthy life, God would yet see him in a place no less or even more exalted than when fortune had cast him down, and prayed him to be of his company as far as Tuscany, as both were going the same way. Alessandro thanked him for his words of comfort, and professed himself ready to obey his every command. So fared on the abbot, his mind full of new ideas begotten by the sight of Alessandro, until some days later they came to a town which was none too well provided with inns, and, as the abbot must needs put up there, Alessandro, who was well acquainted with one of the innkeepers, arranged that the abbot should alight at his house, and procured him the least discomfortable quarters which it could afford. He thus became, for the nonce, the abbot's seneschal, and, being very expert for such office, managed excellently quartering the retinue in divers parts of the town. So the abbot supped, and, the night being far spent, all went to bed, except Alessandro, who then asked the host where he might find quarters for the night. "In good sooth, I know not," replied the host. "Thou seest that every place is occupied, and that I and my household must lie on the benches. However, in the abbot's chamber there are some corn sacks. I can shew thee the way thither, and lay a bit of bed upon them, and there, and it like thee, thou mayst pass the night very well." "How sayest thou?" asked Alessandro. "In the abbot's chamber, which thou knowest is small, and that there was not room for any of the monks to sleep there. Had I understood this when the curtains were drawn, I would have quartered his monks on the corn sacks, and slept myself where the monks sleep. 'Tis even so, however," replied the host, "and thou canst, if thou wilt, find excellent quarters there. The abbot sleeps, the curtains are close drawn. I will go in softly, and lay a small bed there, on which thou canst sleep. Alessandro, satisfied that it might be managed without disturbing the abbot, accepted the offer, and made his arrangements for passing the night as quietly as he could. The abbot was not asleep, his mind being far too overwrought by certain newly awakened desires. He had heard what had passed between Alessandro and the host. He had marked the place where Alessandro had lain down, and in the great gladness of his heart he had begun thus to commune with himself. God has sent me the opportunity of gratifying my desire. If I let it pass, perchance it will be long before another such opportunity occurs. So, being minded by no means to let it slip, when all was quiet in the end, he softly called Alessandro and bade him lie down by his side. Alessandro made many excuses, but ended by undressing and obeying. Whereupon the abbot laid a hand on Alessandro's breast, and began to caress him just as amorous girls do their lovers, whereat Alessandro marvelled greatly, doubting the abbot was prompted to such caresses by a shameful love, which the abbot speedily divined or else surmised from some movement on Alessandro's part, and, laughing, threw off a chemise which she had upon her, and taking Alessandro's hand, laid it on her bosom, saying, "Alessandro, dismiss that foolish thought. Feel here, and learn what I conceal." Alessandro obeyed, laying a hand upon the abbot's bosom, where he encountered two little teats, round, firm, and delicate, as they had been of ivory, whereby he at once knew that 'twas a woman, and without awaiting further encouragement forthwith embraced her, and would have kissed her when she said, "Before thou art more familiar with me, hearken to what I have to say to thee. As thou mayst perceive, I am no man, but a woman. Virgin I left my home, and was going to the Pope to obtain his sanction for my marriage, when, as fortune willed, whether for thy gain or my loss, no sooner had I seen thee the other day than I burned for thee with such a flame of love as never yet had lady for any man. Wherefore I am minded to have thee for my husband rather than any other. So, if thou wilt not have me to wife, depart at once, and return to thine own place." Albeit he knew not who she was, Alessandro, by the retinue which attended her, conjectured that she must be noble and wealthy, and he saw that she was very fair. So it was not long before he answered that, if such were her pleasure, it would be very much to his liking. Whereupon she sat up, set a ring on his finger, and espoused him before a tiny picture of our Lord. After which they embraced, and to their no small mutual satisfaction solaced themselves for the rest of the night. At daybreak Alessandro rose, and, by preconcert with the lady, left the chamber as he had entered it, so that none knew where he had passed the night. Then, blithe at heart beyond measure, he rejoined the abbot and his train, and so, resuming their journey, they after many days arrived at Rome. They had not been there more than a few days when the abbot, attended by the 2 knights and Alessandro, waited on the Pope, whom, after making the due obeisance, he thus addressed: "Holy Father, as you must know better than any other, whoso intends to lead a true and honourable life ought, as far as may be, to shun all occasion of error, for which cause I, having a mind to live honourably, did, the better to accomplish my purpose, assume the habit in which you see me, and depart by stealth from the court of my father, the King of England, who is minded to marry me, young as you see me to be, to the aged King of Scotland, and, carrying with me not a little of his treasure, set my face hitherward, that your holiness might bestow me in marriage. Nor was it the age of the King of Scotland that moved me to flee so much, as fear lest the frailty of my youth should, were I married to him, betray me to commit some breach of divine law, and sully the honour of my father's royal blood. And, as in this frame of mind I journeyed, God, who knows best what is meet for everyone, did, as I believe, of his mercy shew me him who he is pleased to appoint me for my husband, even this young man," pointing to Alessandro, "whom you see by my side, who for nobility of nature and bearing is a match for any great lady, though the strain of his blood perhaps be not of royal purity. Him, therefore, have I chosen, him will I have, and no other, no matter what my father or anyone else may think. And albeit the main purpose with which I started is fulfilled, yet I have thought good to continue my journey, that I may visit the holy and venerable places which abound in this city, and your holiness, and that so in your presence, and by consequence in the presence of others, I may renew my marriage vow with Alessandro, whereof God alone was witness. Wherefore I humbly pray you that God's will and mine may be also yours, and that you pronounce your benison thereon, that therewith, having the more firm assurance of the favour of him whose vicar you are, we may both live together, and, when the time comes, die to God's glory and yours." Alessandro was filled with wonder and secret delight when he heard that his wife was the daughter of the King of England, but greater still was the wonder of the 2 knights, and such their wrath that, had they been anywhere else than in the Pope's presence, they would not have spared to affront Alessandro, and perhaps the lady too. The Pope, on his part, found matter enough for wonder as well in the lady's habit as in her choice. But, knowing that he could not refuse, he consented to grant her request. He therefore began by smoothing the ruffled tempers of the knights, and having reconciled with them the lady and Alessandro, proceeded to put matters in train for the marriage. When the day appointed was come, he gave a great reception, at which were assembled all the cardinals and many other great lords, to whom he presented the lady royally robed, and looking so fair and so gracious that she won, as she deserved, the praise of all. And likewise Alessandro, splendidly arrayed, and bearing himself not a whit like the young usurer, but rather as one of royal blood, for which cause he received due honour from the knights. There, before the Pope himself, the marriage vows were solemnly renewed, and afterwards the marriage, which was accompanied by every circumstance that could add grace and splendour to the ceremony, received the sanction of his benediction. Alessandro and the lady, on leaving Rome, saw fit to visit Florence, whither fame had already wafted the news, so that they were received by the citizens with every token of honour. The lady set the three brothers at liberty, paying all their creditors, and reinstated them and their wives in their several properties. So, leaving gracious memories behind them, Alessandro and his lady, accompanied by Agolante, quitted Florence, and arriving at Paris were honourably received by the king. The two knights went before them to England, and by their influence induced the king to restore the lady to his favour, and receive her and his son-in-law with every circumstance of joy and honour. Alessandro he soon afterwards knighted with unwonted ceremony, and bestowed on him the earldom of Cornwall. And such was the earl's consequence and influence at court that he restored peace between father and son, thereby conferring a great boon on the island and gaining the love and esteem of all the people. Agolante, whom he knighted, recovered all the outstanding debts in full, and returned to Florence immensely rich. The earl passed the rest of his days with his lady in great renown. Indeed, there are those who say that, with the help of his father-in-law, he effected by his policy and valour the conquest of Scotland, and was crowned king of that country. End of Day 2, the third story. Recording by Miette of Miette's Bedtime Story Podcast.
Day 2, the fourth story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa Jevons. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 2, the fourth story. Landolfo Ruffolo is reduced to poverty, turns corsair, is captured by Genoese, is shipwrecked, escapes on a chest full of jewels, and, being cast ashore at Corfu, is hospitably entertained by a woman, and returns home wealthy.
When Pampinea had brought her story to this glorious conclusion, Lauretta, who sate next to her, delayed not, but thus began.
Most gracious ladies, the potency of fortune is never, methinks, more conspicuous than when she raises one, as in Pampinea's story we have seen her raise Alessandro from abject misery to regal state. And such being the limits which our theme henceforth imposes on our invention, I shall feel no shame to tell a story wherein reverses yet greater are compensated by a sequel somewhat less dazzling. Well I know that my story, being compared with its predecessor, will therefore be followed with the less interest, but, failing of necessity, I shall be excused. Scarce any part of Italy is reputed so delectable as the sea coast between Reggio and Gaeta, and in particular the slope which overlooks the sea by Salerno, and which the dwellers there call the slope of Amalfi, is studded with little towns, gardens, and fountains, and peopled by men as wealthy and enterprising in mercantile affairs as there are anywhere to be found, in one of which towns, to wit Ravello, rich as its inhabitants are today, there was formerly a merchant who surpassed them all in wealth, Landolfo Ruffolo by name, who yet not content with his wealth, but desiring to double it, came nigh to lose it all, and his own life to boot. Know then, that this man, having made his calculations, as merchants are wont, bought a great ship, which entirely at his own expense he loaded with divers sorts of merchandise, and sailed to Cyprus. There he found several other ships, each laden with just such a cargo as his own, and was therefore fain to dispose of his goods at a very cheap rate, insomuch that he might almost as well have thrown them away, and was brought to the verge of ruin. Mortified beyond measure to find himself thus reduced in a short space of time from opulence to something like poverty, he was at his wits' end, and rather than go home poor, having left home rich, he was minded to retrieve his losses by piracy, or die in the attempt. So he sold his great ship, and with the price and the proceeds of the sale of his merchandise bought a light bark such as corsairs use, and having excellently well equipped her with the armament and all things else meet for such service, took to scouring the seas as a rover, preying upon all folk alike, but more particularly upon the Turk. In this enterprise he was more favoured by fortune than in his trading adventures. A year had scarce gone by before he had taken so many ships from the Turk that not only had he recovered the fortune which he had lost in trade, but was well on the way to doubling it. The bitter memory of his late losses taught him sobriety. He estimated his gains and found them ample, and lest he should have a second fall, he schooled himself to rest content with them, and made up his mind to return home without attempting to add to them. Shy of adventuring once more in trade, he refrained from investing them in any way, but shaped his course for home, carrying them with him in the very same bark in which he had gotten them. He had already entered the archipelago when one evening a contrary wind sprang up from the south-east, bringing with it a very heavy sea in which his bark could not well have lived. He therefore steered her into a bay under the lee of one of the islets, and there determined to await better weather. As he lay there, 2 great carracks of Genoa, homeward bound from Constantinople, found, not without difficulty, shelter from the tempest in the same bay. The masters of the carracks espied the bark, and found out to whom she belonged. The fame of Landolfo and his vast wealth had already reached them, and had excited their natural cupidity and rapacity. They therefore determined to capture the bark, which lay without means of escape. Part of their men, well armed with crossbows and other weapons, they accordingly sent ashore, so posting them that no one could leave the bark without being exposed to the bolts. The rest took to their boats, and rowed up to the side of Landolfo's little craft, which in a little time, with little trouble and no loss or risk, they captured with all aboard her. They then cleared the bark of all she contained, allowing Landolfo, whom they set aboard one of the carracks, only a pitiful doublet, and sank her. Next day the wind shifted, and the carracks set sail on a westerly course, which they kept prosperously enough throughout the day. But towards evening a tempest arose, and the sea became very boisterous, so that the 2 ships were parted from one another. And such was the fury of the gale, that the ship aboard which was poor hapless Landolfo was driven with prodigious force upon a shoal off the island of Cephalonia, and broke up and went to pieces like so much glass dashed against a wall. Wherefore the unfortunate wretches that were aboard her, launched amid the floating merchandise and chests and planks with which the sea was strewn, did as men commonly do in such a case, and though the night was of the murkiest, and the sea rose and fell in mountainous surges, such as could swim sought to catch hold of whatever chance brought in their way. Among whom hapless Landolfo, who only the day before had again and again prayed for death rather than he should return home in such poverty, now, seeing death imminent, was afraid, and like the rest laid hold of the first plank that came to hand, in the hope that if he could but avoid immediate drowning, God would in some way aid his escape. Gripping the beam with his legs as best he might, while wind and wave tossed him hither and thither, he contrived to keep himself afloat until broad day, when, looking around him, he discerned nothing but clouds and sea and a chest, which, borne by the wave, from time to time drew nigh him, to his extreme terror, for he apprehended it might strike against the plank and do him a mischief, and ever as it came near him he pushed it off with all the little force he had in his hand. But, as it happened, a sudden gust of wind swept down upon the sea, and struck the chest with such force that it was driven against the plank on which Landolfo was, and upset it, and Landolfo went under the waves. Swimming with an energy begotten rather of fear than of strength, he rose to the surface, only to see the plank so far from him that, doubting he could not reach it, he made for the chest, which was close at hand, and resting his breast upon the lid, he did what he could to keep it straight with his arms. In this manner, tossed to and fro by the sea, without tasting food, for not a morsel had he with him, and drinking more than he cared for, knowing not where he was, and seeing nothing but the sea, he remained all that day and the following night. The next day, as the will of God, or the force of the wind, so ordered, more like a sponge than aught else, but still with both hands holding fast by the edges of the chest, as we see those do that clutch aught to save themselves from drowning, he was at length borne to the coast of the island of Corfu, where by chance a poor woman was just then scrubbing her kitchenware with sand and salt water to make it shine. The woman caught sight of him as he drifted shorewards, but making out only a shapeless mass, was at first startled, and shrieked and drew back. Landolfo was scarce able to see, and uttered no sound, for his power of speech was gone. However, when the sea brought him close to the shore, she distinguished the shape of the chest, and gazing more intently, she first made out the arms strained over the chest, and then discerned the face, and divined the truth. So, prompted by pity, she went out a little way into the sea, which was then calm, took him by the hair of the head, and drew him to land, chest and all. Then, not without difficulty, she disengaged his hands from the chest, which she set on the head of a little girl, her daughter, that was with her, carried him home like a little child, and set him in a bath, where she chafed and laved him with warm water, until the vital heat and some part of the strength which he had lost being restored, she saw fit to take him out, and regale him with some good wine and comforts. Thus for some days she tended him as best she could, until he recovered his strength, and knew where he was. Then, in due time, the good woman who had kept his chest safe gave it back to him, and bade him try his fortune. Landolfo could not recall the chest, but took it when she brought it to him, thinking that, however slight its value, it must suffice for a few days' charges. He found it very light, and quite lost hope. But when the good woman was out of doors, he opened it to see what was inside, and found there a great number of precious stones, some set, others unset. Having some knowledge of such matters, he saw at a glance that the stones were of great value, wherefore, feeling that he was still not forsaken by God, he praised his name, and quite recovered heart. But, having in a brief space of time been twice shrewdly hit by the bolts of fortune, he was apprehensive of a third blow, and deemed it meet to use much circumspection in conveying his treasure home, so he wrapped it up in rags as best he could, telling the good woman that he had no more use for the chest, but she might keep it if she wished, and give him a sack in exchange. This the good woman readily did, and he, thanking her as heartily as he could for the service she had rendered him, threw his sack over his shoulders, and, taking ship, crossed to Brindisi. Thence he made his way by the coast as far as Trani, where he found some of his townsfolk that were drapers, to whom he narrated all his adventures except that of the chest. They in charity gave him a suit of clothes, and lent him a horse and their escort as far as Ravello, whither he said he was minded to return. There, thanking God for bringing him safe home, he opened his sack, and examining its contents with more care than before, found the number and fashion of the stones to be such that the sale of them at a moderate price, or even less, would leave him twice as rich as when he left Ravello. So, having disposed of his stones, he sent a large sum of money to Corfu in recompense of the service done him by the good woman who had rescued him from the sea, and also to his friends at Trani, who had furnished him with the clothes. The residue he retained, and making no more ventures in trade, lived and died in honourable estate. End of Day 2, the 4th story.
Day 2, the 18th story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gesine. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J. M. Rigg. Day 2, The 18th story. Andreuccio da Perugia comes to Naples to buy horses, meets with 3 serious adventures in one night, comes safe out of them all, and returns home with a ruby. Landolfo's find of stones, began Fiammetta, on whom the narration now fell, has brought to my mind a story in which there are scarce fewer perilous escapes than in Lauretta's story, but with this difference, that instead of a course of perhaps several years, a single night, as you shall hear, sufficed for their occurrence. In Perugia, by what I once gathered, there lived a young man, Andreuccio di Pietro by name, a horse-dealer, who, having learnt that horses were to be had cheap at Naples, put 500 florins of gold in his purse, and in company with some other merchants went thither, never having been away from home before. On his arrival at Naples, which was on a Sunday evening, about vespers, he learned from his host that the fair would be held on the following morning. Thither accordingly he then repaired, and looked at many horses which pleased him much, and cheapening them more and more, and failing to strike a bargain with any one, he from time to time, being raw and unwary, drew out his purse of florins in view of all that came and went, to show that he meant business. While he was thus chaffering, and after he had shown his purse, there chanced to come by a Sicilian girl, fair as fair could be, but ready to pleasure any man for a small consideration. He did not see her, but she saw him and his purse, and forthwith said to herself, "Who would be in better luck than I, if all those florins were mine?" And so she passed on. With the girl was an old woman, also a Sicilian, who, when she saw Andreuccio, dropped behind the girl and ran towards him, making as if she would tenderly embrace him. The girl, observing this, said nothing, but stopped and waited a little way off for the old woman to rejoin her. Andreuccio turned as the old woman came up, recognized her, and greeted her very cordially, but time and place not permitting much converse, she left him, promising to visit him at his inn, and he resumed his chaffering, but bought nothing that morning. Her old woman's intimate acquaintance with Andreuccio had no more escaped the girl's notice than the contents of Andreuccio's purse, and with the view of devising, if possible, some way to make the money, either in whole or in part, her own, she began cautiously to ask the old woman who and whence he was, what he did there, and how she came to know him. The old woman gave her almost as much and as circumstantial information touching Andreuccio and his affairs as he might have done himself, for she had lived a great while with his father, first in Sicily and afterwards at Perugia. She likewise told the girl the name of his inn, and the purpose with which he had come to Naples. Thus fully armed with the names and all else that was needful for her to know touching Andreuccio's kith and kin, the girl founded thereon her hopes of gratifying her cupidity, and forthwith devised a cunning stratagem to effect her purpose. Home she went, and gave the old woman work enough to occupy her all day, that she might not be able to visit Andreuccio. Then, summoning to her aid a little girl whom she had well trained for such services, she sent her about vespers to the inn where Andreuccio lodged. Arrived there, the little girl asked for Andreuccio of Andreuccio himself, who chanced to be just outside the gate. On his answering that he was the man, she took him aside and said, "Sir, a lady of this country, so please you, would fain speak with you." Whereto he listened with all his ears, and having a great conceit of his person, made up his mind that the lady was in love with him, as if there were ne'er another handsome fellow in Naples but himself. So forthwith he replied that he would wait on the lady, and asked where and when it would be her pleasure to speak with him. "Sir," replied the little girl, "she expects you in her own house, please to come." "Lead on, then, I follow thee," said Andreuccio promptly, vouchsafing never a word to any in the inn. So the little girl guided him to her mistress's house, which was situated in a quarter the character of which may be inferred from its name, Evil Hole. Of this, however, he neither knew nor suspected aught, but, supposing that the quarter was perfectly reputable, and that he was going to see a sweet lady, strode carelessly behind the little girl into the house of her mistress, whom she summoned by calling out, "Andreuccio is here." And Andreuccio then saw her advance to the head of the stairs to await his ascent. She was tall, still in the freshness of her youth, very fair of face, and very richly and nobly clad. As Andreuccio approached, she descended 3 steps to meet him with open arms, and clasped him round the neck, but for a while stood silent, as if from excess of tenderness. Then, bursting into a flood of tears, she kissed his brow, and in slightly broken accents said, "O Andreuccio, welcome, welcome, my Andreuccio!" Quite lost in wonder to be the recipient of such caresses, Andreuccio could only answer, "Madam, well met." Whereupon she took him by the hand, led him up into her saloon, and thence without another word into her chamber, which exhaled through the blended fragrance of roses, orange blossoms, and other perfumes. He observed a handsome curtained bed, dresses and plenty hanging, as is customary in that country, on pegs, and other appointments very fair and sumptuous, which sights, being strange to him, confirmed his belief that he was in the house of no other than a great lady. They sat down side by side on a chest at the foot of the bed, and thus she began to speak. "Andreuccio, I cannot doubt that thou dost marvel both at the caresses which I bestow upon thee, and at my tears, seeing that thou knowest me not, and maybe hast never so much as heard my name. Wait but a moment, and thou shalt learn what perhaps will cause thee to marvel still more, to wit, that I am thy sister, and I tell thee that, since of God's especial grace it is granted me to see one, albeit I would fain see all, of my brothers before I die, I shall not meet death, when the hour comes, without consolation. But thou, perchance, hast never heard aught of this, wherefore listen to what I shall say to thee. Pietro, my father and thine, as I suppose thou mayst have heard, dwelt a long while at Palermo, where his good heart and gracious bearing caused him to be, as he still is, much beloved by all that knew him, but by none was he loved so much as by a gentlewoman, afterwards my mother, then a widow, who, casting aside all respect for her father and brothers, I, in her honour, grew so intimate with him that a child was born, which child am I, thy sister, whom thou seest before thee. Shortly after my birth it so befell that Pietro must needs leave Palermo and return to Perugia, and I, his little daughter, was left behind with my mother at Palermo, nor, so far as I have been able to learn, did he ever again bestow a thought upon either of us. Wherefore, to say nothing of the love which he should have borne me, his daughter, by no servant or woman of low degree, I should, were he not my father, gravely censure the ingratitude which he showed towards my mother, who, prompted by a most loyal love, committed her fortune and herself to his keeping, without so much as knowing who he was. But to what end? The wrongs of long ago are much more easily censured than redressed. Enough that so it was. He left me a little girl at Palermo, where, when I was grown to be almost as thou seest me, my mother, who was a rich lady, gave me in marriage to an honest gentleman of the Girgenti family, who, for love of my mother and myself, settled in Palermo, and there, being a staunch Guelph, entered into correspondence with our King Charles, which being discovered by King Frederick before the time was ripe for action, we had perforce to flee from Sicily just when I was expecting to become the greatest lady that ever was in the island. So, taking with us such few things as we could, few, I say, in comparison of the abundance which we possessed, we bade adieu to our estates and palaces, and found a refuge in this country, and such favour with King Charles that, in partial compensation for the losses which we had sustained on his account, he has granted us estates and houses and an ample pension. which he regularly pays to my husband and thy brother-in-law, as thou mayst yet see. In this manner I live here, but that I am blessed with the sight of thee, I ascribe entirely to the mercy of God, and no thanks to thee, my sweet brother." So saying, she embraced him again, and melting anew into tears, kissed his brow. This story, so congruous, so consistent in every detail, came trippingly and without the least hesitancy from her tongue. Andreuccio remembered that his father had indeed lived at Palermo. He knew by his own experience the ways of young folk, how prone they are to love. He saw her melt into tears, he felt her embraces and sisterly kisses, and he took all she said for gospel. So, when she had done, he answered, "Madam, it should not surprise you that I marvel, seeing that, in sooth, my father, for whatever cause, said never a word of you and your mother, or, if he did so, it came not to my knowledge, so that I knew no more of you than if you had not been. Wherefore the lonelier I am here, and the less hope I had of such good luck, the better pleased I am to have found here my sister. And indeed I know not any man, however exalted his station, who ought not to be well pleased to have such a sister, much more than I, who am but a petty merchant. But, I pray you, resolve me of one thing, how came you to know that I was here?" Then answered she, "'Twas told me this morning by a poor woman, who is much about the house, because, as she tells me, she was long in the service of our father, both at Palermo and at Perugia, and that it seemed more fitting that thou shouldst come to see me at home than that I should visit thee at an inn. I had long ago sought thee out." She then began to inquire particularly after all his kinsfolk by name, and Andreuccio, becoming ever more firmly persuaded of that which it was least for his good to believe, answered all her questions. Their conversation being thus prolonged, and the heat great, she had Greek wine and sweetmeats brought in, and gave Andreuccio to drink. And when towards supper time he made as if he would leave, she would in no wise suffer it, but feigning to be very much vexed, she embraced him, saying, "Alas! now 'tis plain how little thou carest for me, to think that thou art with thy sister, whom thou seest for the first time, and in her own house, where thou shouldst have alighted on thine arrival, and thou wouldst fain depart hence to go to sup at an inn. Nay, but for certain thou shalt sup with me, and albeit to my great regret my husband is not here, thou shalt see that I can do a lady's part in showing thee honour." Andreuccio, not knowing what else to say, replied, "Sister, I care for you with all a brother's affection, but if I go not, supper will await me all the evening at the inn, and I shall justly be taxed with discourtesy." Then said she, "Blessed be God, there is even now in the house one by whom I can send word that they are not to expect thee at the inn, albeit thou wouldst far better discharge the debt of courtesy by sending word to thy friends, that they come here to sup, and then, if go thou must, you might all go in a body." Andreuccio replied that he would have none of his friends that evening, but since she would have him stay, he would even do her the pleasure. She then made a show of sending word to the inn that they should not expect him at dinner. Much more talk followed, and then they sat down to a supper of many courses, splendidly served, which she cunningly protracted until nightfall, nor when they were risen from table, and Andreuccio was about to take his departure, would she by any means suffer it, saying that Naples was no place to walk about in after dark, least of all for a stranger, and that as she had sent word to the inn that they were not to expect him at supper, so she had done the like in regard of his bed. Believing what she said, and being, in his false confidence, overjoyed to be with her, he stayed. After supper there was matter enough for talk both various and prolonged, and when the night was in a measure spent, she gave up her own chamber to Andreuccio, leaving him with a small boy to show him aught that he might have need of, while she retired with her women to another chamber. It was a very hot night, so no sooner was Andreuccio alone that he stripped himself to his doublet, and drew off his stockings and laid them on the bed's head, and nature demanding a discharge of the surplus weight which he carried within him, he asked the lad where this might be done, and was shown a door in a corner of the room, and told to go in there. Andriuccio, nothing doubting, did so, but by ill luck set his foot on a plank which was detached from the joist at the further end, whereby down it went, and he with it. By grace he took no hurt by the fall, though it was from some height, beyond sousing himself from head to foot in the ordure which filled the whole place, which, that you may the better understand what has been said, and that which is to follow, I will describe to you. A narrow and blind alley, such as we commonly see between two houses, was spanned by planks supported by joists on either side, and on the planks was the stool, of which planks that which fell with Andriuccio was one. Now Andriuccio, finding himself down there in the alley, fell to calling on the lad, who, as soon as he heard him fall, had run off, and promptly let the lady know what had happened. She hied forthwith to her chamber, and after a hasty search found Andriuccio's clothes and the money in them, for he foolishly thought to secure himself against risk by carrying it always on his person, and thus being possessed of the prize for which she had played her ruse, passing herself off as the sister of a man of Perugia, whereas she was really of Palermo, she concerned herself no further with Andriuccio, except to close with all speed the door by which she had gone out when he fell. As the lad did not answer, Andriuccio began to shout more loudly, but all to no purpose, whereby his suspicions were aroused, and he began at last to perceive the trick that had been played upon him, so he climbed over a low wall that divided the alley from the street, and hied him to the door of the house, which he knew very well. There for a long while he stood shouting and battering the door till it shook on its hinges, but all again to no purpose. No doubt of his misadventure now lurking in his mind, he fell to bewailing himself, saying, "Alas! in how brief a time have I lost 500 florins and a sister!" with much more of the like sort. Then he recommenced battering the door and shouting, to such a tune that not a few of the neighbours were roused, and finding the nuisance intolerable, got up, and one of the lady's servant girls presented herself at the window with a very sleepy air, and said angrily, "Who knocks below there?" "Oh," said Andriuccio, "dost not know me? I am Andriuccio, Madame Fiordaliso's brother." "Good man," she rejoined, "if thou hast had too much to drink, go sleep it off and come back to-morrow. I know not Andriuccio, nor aught of the fantastic stuff thou pratest. Prithee be gone, and be so good as to let us sleep in peace." "How?" said Andriuccio, "dost not understand what I say? For sure thou dost understand, but if Sicilian kinships are of such a sort that folk forget them so soon, at least return me my clothes, which I left within, and right glad shall I be to be off." Half laughing she rejoined, "Good man, methinks thou dost dream," and so saying she withdrew and closed the window. Andriuccio by this time needed no further evidence of his wrongs. His wrath knew no bounds, and mortification well nigh converted it into frenzy. He was minded to exact by force, which he had failed to obtain by entreaties, and so, arming himself with a large stone, he renewed his attack upon the door with fury, dealing much heavier blows than at first. Wherefore not a few of the neighbours, whom he had already roused from their beds, set him down as an ill-conditioned rogue, and his story as a mere fiction intended to annoy the good woman, and resenting the din which he now made, came to their windows, just as, when a stranger dog makes his appearance, all the dogs of the quarter will run to bark at him, and called out in chorus, "'Tis a gross affront to come at this time of night to the house of the good woman with this silly story. Prithee, good man, let us sleep in peace. Be gone in God's name, and if thou hast a score to settle with her, come to-morrow, but a truce to thy pestering to-night." Emboldened, perhaps, by these words, a man who lurked within the house, the good woman's bully, whom Andriuccio had as yet neither seen nor heard, showed himself at the window, and said in a gruff voice and savage, menacing tone, "Who is below there?" Andriuccio looked up in the direction of the voice, and saw standing at the window, yawning and rubbing his eyes, as if he had just been roused from his bed, or at any rate from deep sleep, a fellow with a black and matted beard, who, as far as Andriuccio's means of judging went, bade fair to prove a most redoubtable champion. It was not without fear, therefore, that he replied, "I am a brother of the lady who is within." The bully did not wait for him to finish his sentence, but addressing him in a much sterner tone than before, called out, "I know not why I come not down and give thee play with my cudgel, whilst thou givest me sign of life, ass, tedious driveller that thou must needs be, and drunken sot, thus to disturb our night's rest." Which said, he withdrew, and closed the window. Some of the neighbours who best knew the bully's quality gave Andriuccio fair words. "For God's sake," said they, "good man, take thyself off. Stay not here to be murdered. 'Twere best for thee to go." These counsels, which seemed to be dictated by charity, reinforced the fear which the voice and aspect of the bully had inspired in Andriuccio, who, thus despairing of recovering his money, and in the deepest of dumps, set his face towards the quarter whence in the daytime he had blindly followed the little girl, and began to make his way back to the inn. But so noisome was the stench which he emitted, that he resolved to turn aside and take a bath in the sea. So he bore leftward up a street called Ruga Catalana, and was on his way towards the steep of the city, when by chance he saw two men coming towards him, bearing a lantern, and fearing that they might be patrols or other men who might do him a mischief, he stole away and hid himself in a dismantled house to avoid them. The house, however, was presently entered by the two men, just as if they had been guided thither, and one of them having disburdened himself of some iron tools which he carried on his shoulder, they both began to examine them, passing meanwhile divers comments upon them. While they were thus occupied, "What," said one, "means this? Such a stench as I never before did smell the like." So saying, he raised the lantern a little, whereby they had a view of hapless Andriuccio, and asked in amazement, "Who is there?" Whereupon Andriuccio was at first silent, but when they flashed the light close upon him, and asked him what he did there in such a filthy state, he told them all that had befallen him. Casting about to fix the place where it occurred, they said one to another, "Of a surety 'twas the house of Scarabone Buttafuoco." Then said one, turning to Andriuccio, "Good man, albeit thou hast lost thy money, thou hast cause enough to praise God that thou hadst the luck to fall, for hadst thou not fallen, be sure that no sooner wert thou asleep, that thou hadst been knocked on the head, and lost not only thy money, but thy life. But what boots it now to bewail thee? Thou mightest as soon pluck a star from the firmament, as recover a single denier. Nay, 'tis as much as thy life is worth, if he do but hear that thou breathest a word of the affair." The two men then held a short consultation, at the close of which they said, "Lo now, we are sorry for thee, and so we make thee a fair offer. If thou wilt join with us in a little matter which we have in hand, we doubt not but thy share of the gain will greatly exceed what thou hast lost." Andriuccio, being now desperate, answered that he was ready to join them. Now Messer Filippo Minutolo, Archbishop of Naples, had that day been buried with a ruby on his finger, worth over 500 florins of gold, besides other ornaments of extreme value. The two men were minded to despoil the Archbishop of his fine trappings, and imparted their design to Andriuccio, who, cupidity getting the better of caution, approved it, and so they all three set forth. But as they were on their way to the cathedral, Andriuccio gave out so rank an odour that one said to the other, "Can we not contrive that he somehow wash himself a little, that he stink not so shrewdly?" "Why, yes," said the other, "we are now close to a well, which is never without the pulley and a large bucket. 'Tis but a step thither, and we will wash him out of hand." Arrived at the well, they found that the rope was still there, but the bucket had been removed, so they determined to attach him to the rope and lower him into the well, there to wash himself, which done he was to jerk the rope, and they would draw him up. Lowered accordingly he was, but just as, now washen, he jerked the rope, it so happened that the company of patrols, being thirsty, because 'twas a hot night, and some rogue had led them a pretty dance, came to the well to drink. The two men fled unobserved, as soon as they caught sight of the newcomers, who, parched with thirst, laid aside their bucklers, arms, and surcoats, and fell to hauling on the rope, supposing that it bore the bucket full of water. When, therefore, they saw Andriuccio, as he neared the brink of the well, loose the rope and clutch the brink with his hands, they were stricken with a sudden terror, and without uttering a word let go the rope, and took to flight with all the speed they could make. Whereat Andriuccio marvelled mightily, and had he not kept tight grip on the brink of the well, he would certainly have gone back to the bottom, and hardly have escaped grievous hurt or death. Still greater was his astonishment when, fairly landed on terra firma, he found the patrol's arms lying there, which he knew had not been carried by his comrades. He felt a vague dread, he knew not why. He bewailed once more his evil fortune, and without venturing to touch the arms, he left the well, and wandered he knew not whither. As he went, however, he fell in with his two comrades, now returning to draw him out of the well, who no sooner saw him than in utter amazement they demanded who had hauled him up. Andriuccio answered that he knew not, and then told them in detail how it had come about, and what he had found beside the well. They laughed as they apprehended the circumstances, and told him why they had fled, and who they were that had hauled him up. Then, without further parley, for it was now midnight, they hied them to the cathedral. They had no difficulty in entering and finding the tomb, which was a magnificent structure of marble, and with their iron implements they raised the lid, albeit it was very heavy, to a height sufficient to allow a man to enter, and propped it up. This done, a dialogue ensued. "Who shall go in?" said one. "Not I," said the other. "Nor I," rejoined his companion. "Let Andriuccio go in." "That will not I," said Andriuccio. Whereupon both turned upon him and said, "How, thou wilt not go in? By God, if thou goest not in, we will give thee that over the pate with one of these iron crowbars, that thou shalt drop down dead." Terror-stricken, into the tomb Andriuccio went, saying to himself as he did so, "These men will have me go in, that they may play a trick upon me. When I have handed everything up to them, and am sweating myself to get out of the tomb, they will be off about their business, and I shall be left with nothing for my pains." So he determined to make sure of his own part first, and bethinking him of the precious ring of which he had heard them speak, as soon as he had completed the descent, he drew the ring off the archbishop's finger and put it on his own. He then handed up, one by one, the crosier, mitre, and gloves, and other of the archbishop's trappings, stripping him to his shirt. Which done, he told his comrades that there was nothing more. They insisted that the ring must be there, and bade him search everywhere. This he feigned to do, ejaculating from time to time that he found it not, and thus he kept them a little while in suspense. But they, who were in their way as cunning as he, kept on exhorting him to make a careful search, and seizing their opportunity, withdrew the prop that supported the lid of the tomb, and took to their heels, leaving him there a close prisoner. You will readily conceive how Andriuccio behaved when he understood his situation. More than once he applied his head and shoulders to the lid, and sought with might and main to heave it up, but all his efforts were fruitless, so that at last, overwhelmed with anguish, he fell in a swoon on the corpse of the archbishop. And whether of the twain were the most lifeless, Andriuccio or the archbishop, 'twould have puzzled an observer to determine. When he came to himself he burst into a torrent of tears, seeing now nothing in store for him but either to perish there of hunger and fetid odours, beside the corpse and among the worms, or, should the tomb be earlier opened, to be taken and hanged as a thief. These most lugubrious meditations were interrupted by a sound of persons walking and talking in the church. They were evidently a numerous company, and to their purpose, as Andriuccio surmised, was the very same with which he and his comrades had come thither, whereby his terror was mightily increased. Presently the folk opened the tomb, and propped up the lid, and then fell to disputing as to who should go in. None was willing, and the contention was protracted, but at length one, 'twas a priest, said, Of what are ye afeard? Think ye to be eaten by him? Nay, the dead eat not the living. I will go in myself. So saying, he propped his breast upon the edge of the lid, threw his head back, and thrust his legs within, that he might go down feet foremost. On sight whereof Andreuccio started to his feet, and seizing hold of one of the priest's legs, made as if he would drag him down, which caused the priest to utter a prodigious yell, and bundle himself out of the tomb with no small celerity. The rest took to flight in a panic, as if 100,000 devils were at their heels. The tomb being thus left open, Andreuccio, the ring still on his finger, sprang out. The way by which he had entered the church served him for egress, and roaming at random, he arrived towards daybreak at the coast. Diverging thence, he came by chance upon his inn, where he found that his host and his comrades had been anxious about him all night. When he told them all that had befallen him, they joined with the host in advising him to leave Naples at once. He accordingly did so, and returned to Perugia, having invested in a ring the money with which he had intended to buy horses. End of Day 2, the 18th story.
Day 2, the 6th story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by G.M. Rigg. Day 2, the 6th story. Madame Beritola loses 2 sons, is found with 2 kids on an island, goes thence to Lunigiana, where one of her sons takes service with her master and lies with his daughter, for which he is put in prison. Sicily rebels against King Charles, the son is recognized by the mother, marries the master's daughter, and, his brother being discovered, is reinstated in great honor.
The ladies and the young men alike had many a hearty laugh over Fiammetta's narrative of Andreuccio's adventures, which ended, Emilia, at the queen's command, thus began.
Grave and grievous are the vicissitudes with which fortune makes us acquainted, and as discourse of such matter serves to awaken our minds, which are so readily lulled to sleep by her flatteries, I deem it worthy of attentive hearing by all, whether they enjoy her favour or endure her frown, in that it ministers counsel to the one sort and consolation to the other. Wherefore, albeit great matters have preceded it, I mean to tell you a story not less true than touching, of adventures whereof the issue was indeed felicitous, but the antecedent bitterness so long drawn out, that scarce can I believe that it was ever sweetened by ensuing happiness. Dearest ladies, you must know that after the death of the Emperor Frederick II, the crown of Sicily passed to Manfred, whose favour was enjoyed in the highest degree by a gentleman of Naples, Arrighetto Capecci by name, who had to wife Madonna Beritola Caricciola, a fair and gracious lady, likewise a Neapolitan. Now, when Manfred was conquered and slain by King Charles I at Benevento, and the whole realm transferred its allegiance to the conqueror, Arrighetto, who was then governor of Sicily, no sooner received the tidings than he prepared for instant flight, knowing that little reliance was to be placed on the fleeting faith of the Sicilians, and not being minded to become a subject of his master's enemy. But the Sicilians having intelligence of his plans, he and many other friends and servants of King Manfred were surprised, taken prisoners, and delivered over to King Charles, to whom the whole island was soon afterwards surrendered. In this signal reversal of the wonted course of things, Madame Beritola, knowing not what was become of Arrighetto, and from the past ever auguring future evil, lest she should suffer foul dishonour, abandoned all that she possessed, and with a son of perhaps 8 years, Giusfredi by name, being also pregnant, fled in a boat to Lipari, where she gave birth to another male child, whom she named Outcast. Then, with her sons and a hired nurse, she took ship for Naples, intending there to rejoin her family. Events, however, fell out otherwise than she expected, for by stress of weather the ship was carried out of her course to the desert island of Ponza, where they put in to a little bay until such time as they might safely continue their voyage. Madame Beritola landed with the rest on the island, and, leaving them all, sought out a lonely and secluded spot, and there abandoned herself to melancholy brooding on the loss of her dear Arigetto. While thus she spent her days in solitary preoccupation with her grief, it chanced that a galley of corsairs swooped down upon the island, and, before either the mariners or any other folk were aware of their peril, made an easy capture of them all, and sailed away. So that, when Madame Beritola, her wailing for that day ended, returned, as was her wont, to the shore to solace herself with the sight of her sons, she found none there. At first she was lost in wonder, then, with a sudden suspicion of the truth, she bent her eyes seaward, and there saw the galley still at no great distance, towing the ship in her wake. Thus, apprehending beyond all manner of doubt that she had lost her sons as well as her husband, and that, alone, desolate and destitute, she might not hope that any of her lost ones would ever be restored to her, she fell down on the shore in a swoon, with the names of her husband and sons upon her lips. None was there to administer cold water or aught else that might recall her truant powers. Her animal spirits might even wander whithersoever they would at their sweet will. Strength, however, did at last return to her poor exhausted frame, and therewith tears and lamentations, as, plaintively repeating her sons' names, she roamed in quest of them from cavern to cavern. Long time she sought them thus, but when she saw that her labour was in vain, and that night was closing in, hope, she knew not why, began to return, and with it some degree of anxiety on her own account. Wherefore she left the shore and returned to the cavern where she had been wont to indulge her plaintive mood. She passed the night in no small fear and indescribable anguish. The new day came, and, as she had not supped, she was fain after thirst to appease her hunger, as best she could, by a breakfast of herbs. This done, she wept, and began to ruminate on her future way of life. While thus engaged, she observed a she-goat come by and go into an adjacent cavern, and after a while come forth again and go into the wood. Thus roused from her reverie, she got up, went into the cavern from which the she-goat had issued, and there saw 2 kits, which might have been born that very day, and seemed to her the sweetest and the most delicious things in the world. And having, by reason of her recent delivery, milk still within her, she took them up tenderly, and set them to her breast. They, nothing loath, sucked at her teats as if she'd been their own dam, and thenceforth made no distinction between her and the dam, which caused the lady to feel that she had found company in the desert, and so, living on herbs and water, weeping as often as she bethought her of her husband and sons and her past life, she disposed herself to live and die there, and become no less familiar with the she-goat than with her young. The gentle lady thus leading the life of a wild creature, it chanced that after some months, stress of weather brought a peasant ship to the very same bay in which she had landed. The ship lay there for several days, having on board a gentleman, Curado Malespini by name, of the same family as the Marquis, who, with his noble and most devout lady, was returning home from a pilgrimage, having visited all the holy places in the realm of Apulia. To beguile the tedium of the sojourn, Curado, with his lady, some servants, and his dogs, set forth one day upon a tour through the island. As they neared the place where Madame Beritola dwelt, Curado's dogs, on view of the 2 kids, which, now of a fair size, were grazing, gave chase. The kids, pursued by the dogs, made straight for Madame Beritola's cavern. She, seeing what was toward, started to her feet, caught up a stick, and drove the dogs back. Curado and his lady, coming up after the dogs, gazed on Madame Beritola, now tanned and lean and hairy, with wonder, which she more than reciprocated. At her request, Curado called off the dogs, and then he and his lady besought her again and again to say who she was and what she did there. So she told them all about herself, her rank, her misfortunes, and the savage life which she was minded to lead. Curado, who had known Arigetto Capece very well, was moved to tears by compassion, and exhausted all his eloquence to induce her to change her mind, offering to escort her home, or to take her to live with him in honourable estate as his sister, until God should vouchsafe her a kindlier fortune. The lady declining all his offers, Curado left her with his wife, whom he bade see that food was brought thither, and let Madame Baritola, who was all in rags, have one of her own dresses to wear, and do all that she could to persuade her to go with them. So the gentle lady stayed with Madame Baritola, and after condoling with her at large on her misfortunes, had food and clothing brought to her, and with the greatest difficulty in the world prevailed upon her to eat and dress herself. At last, after much beseeching, she induced her to depart from her oft-declared intention never to go where she might meet any that knew her, and accompany them to Lunigiana, taking with her the 2 kits and the dam, which latter had in the meantime returned, and to the gentle lady's great surprise had greeted Madame Baritola with the utmost affection. So, with the return of fair weather, Madame Baritola, taking with her the dam and the 2 kits, embarked with Curado and his lady on their ship, being called by them, for her true name was not to be known of all, Cavriola, and the wind holding fair, they speedily reached the mouth of the Magra, and landing, hied them to Curado's castle, where Madame Baritola abode with Curado's lady in the quality of her maid, serving her well and faithfully, wearing widow's weeds, and feeding and tending her kids with assiduous and loving care. The corsairs, who, not espying Madame Baritola, had left her at Ponza when they took the ship on which she had come thither, had made a course to Genoa, taking with them all the other folk. On their arrival, the owners of the galley shared the booty, and so it happened that as part thereof Madame Baritola's nurse and her 2 boys fell to the lot of one Messer Gasparino Doria, who sent all 3 to his house, being minded to keep them there as domestic slaves. The nurse, beside herself with grief at the loss of her mistress and the woeful plight in which she found herself and her 2 charges, shed many a bitter tear. But, seeing that they were unavailing, and that she and the boys were slaves together, she, having for all her low estate her share of wit and good sense, made it her first care to comfort them. Then, regardful of the condition to which they were reduced, she bethought her that, if the lads were recognized, it would very likely be injurious to them. So, still hoping that some time or another fortune would change her mood, and they be able, if living, to regain their lost estate, she resolved to let none know who they were, until she saw a fitting occasion, and, accordingly, whenever she was questioned thereof by any, she gave them out as her own children. The name of the elder she changed from Giusfredi to Gianotto di Procida. The name of the younger she did not think it worth while to change. She spared no pains to make Giusfredi understand the reason why she had changed his name, and the risk which he might run if he were recognized. This she impressed upon him not once only but many times, and the boy, who was apt to learn, followed the instructions of the wise nurse with perfect exactitude. So the 2 boys, ill-clad and worse shod, continued with the nurse in Messer Gasparino's house for 2 years, patiently performing all kinds of menial offices. But Gianotto, being now 16 years old, and of a spirit that consorted ill with servitude, brooked not the baseness of his lot, and dismissed himself from Messer Gasparino's service by getting aboard a galley bound for Alexandria, and travelled far and wide, and fared never the better. In the course of his wanderings he learned that his father, whom he had supposed to be dead, was still living, but kept in prison under watch and ward by King Charles. He was grown a tall, handsome young man, when, perhaps 3 or 4 years after he had given Messer Gasparino the slip, weary of roaming and all but despairing of his fortune, he came to Lunigiana, and by chance took service with Curado Malaspini, who found him handy, and was well pleased with him. His mother, who was in attendance on Curado's lady, he seldom saw, and never recognized her, nor she him. So much had time changed both from their former aspect since they last met. While Gianotto was thus in the service of Curado, it fell out by the death of Niccolo da Grignano that his widow, Spina, Curado's daughter, returned to her father's house. Very fair she was, and lovable, her age not more than 16 years, and so it was that she saw Gianotto with favour, and he her, and both fell ardently in love with one another. Their passion was early gratified, but several months elapsed before any detected its existence, wherefore, growing overbold, they began to dispense with the precautions which such an affair demanded. So one day, as they walked with others through a wood, where the trees grew fair and close, the girl and Gianotto left the rest of the company some distance behind, and, thinking that they were well in advance, found a fair pleasance girt in with trees and carpeted with abundance of grass and flowers, and fell to solacing themselves after the manner of lovers. Long time they thus dallied, though such was their delight that all too brief it seemed to them, and so it befell that they were surprised first by the girl's mother and then by Curado. Pained beyond measure by what he had seen, Curado, without assigning any cause, had them both arrested by 3 of his servants and taken in chains to one of his castles, where in a frenzy of passionate wrath he left them, resolved to put them to an ignominious death. The girl's mother was also very angry, and deemed her daughter's fall deserving of the most rigorous chastisement, but when by one of Curado's chance words she divined the doom which he destined for the guilty pair, she could not reconcile herself to it, and hasted to intercede with her angry husband, beseeching him to refrain the impetuous wrath which would hurry him in his old age to murder his daughter and imbue his hands in the blood of his servant, and vent it in some other way, as by close confinement and duress, whereby the culprits should be brought to repent them of their fault in tears. Thus, and with much more to the like effect, the devout lady urged her suit, and at length prevailed upon her husband to abandon his murderous design. Wherefore he commanded that the pair should be confined in separate prisons, and closely guarded, and kept short of food and in sore discomfort, until further order, which was accordingly done, and the life which the captives led, their endless tears, their fasts of inordinate duration, may be readily imagined. Gianotto and Spina had languished in this sorry plight for full a year, entirely ignored by Curado, when, in concert with Messer Gian di Procida, King Peter of Aragon raised a rebellion in the island of Sicily, and wrested it from King Charles, whereat Curado, being a Ghibelline, was overjoyed. Hearing the tidings from one of his warders, Gianotto heaved a great sigh, and said, "Alas! 14 years have I been a wanderer upon the face of the earth, looking for no other than this very event, and now that my hopes of happiness may be for ever frustrate, it has come to pass only to find me in prison, whence I may never think to issue alive." "How?" said the warder. "What signify to thee these doings of these mighty monarchs? What part hadst thou in Sicily?" Gianotto answered, "'Tis as if my heart were breaking, when I bethink me of my father, and what part he had in Sicily. I was but a little lad when I fled the island, but yet I remember him as its governor in the time of King Manfred." "And who then was thy father?" demanded the warder. "His name," rejoined Gianotto, "I need no longer scruple to disclose, seeing that I find myself in the very strait which I hope to avoid by concealing it. He was, and still is, if he live, Argetto Capece, and my name is not Gianotto, but Giusfredi, and I doubt not but, were I once free and back in Sicily, I might yet hold a very honourable position in the island." The worthy man asked no more questions, but, as soon as he found opportunity, told what he had learned to Corrado, who, albeit he made light of it in the warder's presence, repaired to Madame Beritola, and asked her in a pleasant manner whether she had had by Argetto a son named Giusfredi. The lady answered in tears that if the elder of the 2 sons were living, such would be his name, and his age 22 years. This inclined Corrado to think that Gianotto and Giusfredi were indeed one and the same, and it occurred to him that, if so it were, he might at once show himself most merciful, and blot out his daughter's shame and his own by giving her to him in marriage. Wherefore he sent for Gianotto privily, and questioned him in detail touching his past life, and finding by indubitable evidence that he was indeed Giusfredi, son of Argetto Capece, he said to him, "Gianotto, thou knowest the wrong which thou hast done me in the person of my daughter, what and how great it is, seeing that I used thee well and kindly, and thou shouldst therefore, like a good servant, have shown thyself jealous of my honour, and zealous in my interest; and many there are who, hadst thou treated them as thou hast treated me, would have caused thee to die an ignominious death, which my clemency would not brook. But now, as it is even so as thou sayest, and thou art of gentle blood by both thy parents, I am minded to put an end to thy sufferings as soon as thou wilt, releasing thee from the captivity in which thou languishest, and setting thee in a happy place, and reinstating at once thy honour and my own. Thy intimacy with Spina, albeit shameful to both, was yet prompted by love. Spina, as thou knowest, is a widow, and her dower is ample and secure. What her breeding is, and her father's and her mother's, thou knowest. of thy present condition I say naught. Wherefore, when thou wilt, I am consenting that, having been with dishonour thy friend, she become with honour thy wife, and that, so long as it seem good to thee, thou tarry here with her and me as my son." Captivity had wasted Gianotto's flesh, but had in no degree impaired the generosity of spirit which he derived from his ancestry, or the whole-hearted love which he bore his lady. So, albeit he ardently desired that which Corrado offered, and knew that he was in Corrado's power, yet, even as his magnanimity prompted, so unswervingly he made answer: "Corrado, neither ambition nor cupidity, nor aught else, did ever beguile me to any treacherous machination against either thy person or thy property. Thy daughter I loved, and shall ever love, because I deem her worthy of my love; and, if I dealt with her after a fashion which to the mechanic mind seems hardly honourable, I did but commit that fault which is ever congenial to youth, which can never be eradicated so long as youth continues, and which, if the aged would but remember that they were once young, and would measure the delinquencies of others by their own, and their own by those of others, would not be deemed so grave as thou and many others depict it. And what I did as a friend, not as an enemy. That which thou offerest I have ever desired, and should long ago have sought, had I supposed that thou wouldst grant it, and 'twill be the more grateful to me in proportion to the depth of my despair. But if thy intent be not such as thy words import, feed me not with vain hopes, but send me back to prison, there to suffer whatever thou mayst be pleased to inflict, nor doubt that even as I love Spina, so for love of her shall I ever love thee, though thou do thy worst, and still hold thee in reverent regard." Corrado marvelled to hear him thus speak, and being assured of his magnanimity and the fervour of his love, held him the more dear; wherefore he rose, embraced and kissed him, and without further delay bade privily bring thither Spina, who left her prison wasted and wan and weak, and so changed that she seemed almost another woman than of yore, even as Gianotto was scarce his former self. Then and there in Corrado's presence they plighted their troth, according to our custom of espousals, and some days afterwards Corrado, having in the meantime provided all things meet for their convenience and solace, yet so as that none should surmise what had happened, deemed it now time to gladden their mothers with the news. So he sent for his lady and Gavriola, and thus, addressing first Gavriola, he spoke: "What would you say, madam, were I to restore you your elder son as the husband of one of my daughters?" Gavriola answered: "I would say that, were it possible for you to strengthen the bond which attaches me to you, then assuredly you had so done, in that you restored to me that which I cherish more tenderly than myself, and in such a guise as in some measure to renew within me the hope which I had lost. More I could not say." And so, weeping, she was silent. Then, turning to his lady, Corrado said, "And thou, madam, what wouldst thou think, if I were to present thee with such a son-in-law?" "A son-in-law," she answered, "that was not of gentle blood, but a mere churl, so he pleased you, would well content me." "So," returned Corrado, "I hope within a few days to gladden the hearts of both of you." He waited only until the two young folk had recovered their wonted mien, and were clad in a manner befitting their rank. Then, addressing Giusfredi, he said, "Would it not add to thy joy to see thy mother here?" "I dare not hope," returned Giusfredi, "that she has survived calamities and sufferings such as hers; but were it so, great indeed would be my joy, and none the less that by her counsel I might be aided to the recovery, in great measure, of my lost heritage in Sicily." Whereupon Corrado caused both the ladies to come thither, and presented to them the bride. The gladness with which they both greeted her was a wonder to behold, and no less great was their wonder at the benign inspiration that had prompted Corrado to unite her in wedlock with Gianotto, whom Corrado's words caused Madame Beritola to survey with some attention. A hidden spring of memory was thus touched. She recognized in the man the lineaments of her boy, and awaiting no further evidence, she ran with open arms and threw herself upon his neck. No word did she utter, for very excess of maternal tenderness and joy, but, every avenue of sense closed, she fell as if bereft of life within her son's embrace. Gianotto, who had often seen her in the castle, and never recognized her, marvelled not a little, but nevertheless it at once flashed upon him that 'twas his mother, and blaming himself for his past inadvertence, he took her in his arms, and wept, and tenderly kissed her. With gentle solicitude Curado's lady and Spina came to her aid, and restored her suspended animation with cold water and other remedies. She then, with many tender and endearing words, kissed him 1,000 times or more, which tokens of her love he received with a look of reverential acknowledgment. Thrice, nay, a 4th time, were these glad and gracious greetings exchanged, and joyful indeed were they that witnessed them, and hearkened while mother and son compared their past adventures. Then Curado, who had already announced his new alliance to his friends, and received their felicitations, proceeded to give order for the celebration of the event with all becoming gaiety and splendour. As he did so, Giusfredi said to him, "Curado, you have long given my mother honourable entertainment, and on me you have conferred many boons, wherefore, that you may fill up the measure of your kindness, 'tis now my prayer that you will be pleased to gladden my mother and my marriage feast and me with the presence of my brother, now in servitude in the house of Messer Gasparino Doria, who, as I have already told you, made prize of both him and me, and that then you send some one to Sicily, who shall make himself thoroughly acquainted with the circumstances and condition of the country, and find out how it has fared with my father Arigetto, whether he be alive or dead, and if alive, in what circumstances, and being thus fully informed, return to us with the tidings." Curado assented, and forthwith sent most trusty agents both to Genoa and to Sicily. So in due time an envoy arrived at Genoa, and made instant suit to Gasparino on Curado's part for the surrender of Outcast and the nurse, setting forth in detail all that had passed between Curado and Giusfredi and his mother. Whereat Messer Gasparino was mightily astonished, and said, "Of a surety there is naught that, being able, I would not do to pleasure Curado, and true it is that I have had in my house for these 14 years the boy whom thou dost now demand of me, and his mother, and gladly will I surrender them. But tell Curado from me to beware of excessive credulity, and to put no faith in the idle tales of Gianotto, or Giusfredi, as thou sayest he calls himself, who is by no means so guileless as he supposes." Then, having provided for the honourable entertainment of the worthy envoy, he sent privily for the nurse, and cautiously sounded her as to the affair. The nurse had heard of the revolt of Sicily, and had learned that Arigetto was still alive. She therefore banished fear, and told Messer Gasparino the whole story, and explained to him the reasons why she had acted as she had done. Finding that what she said accorded very well with what he had learned from Curado's envoy, he inclined to credit the story, and most astutely probing the matter in divers ways, and always finding fresh grounds for confidence, he reproached himself for the sorry manner in which he had treated the boy, and by way of amends gave him one of his own daughters, a beautiful girl of 11 years, to wife with a dowry suited to Arigetto's rank, and celebrated their nuptials with great festivity. He then brought the boy and girl, Curado's envoy, and the nurse in a well-armed galliot to Lerici, being there met by Curado, who had a castle not far off, where great preparations had been made for their entertainment, and thither accordingly he went with his whole company. What cheer the mother had of her son, the brothers of one another, and all the 3 of their faithful nurse! What cheer Messer Gasparino and his daughter had of all, and all of them, and what cheer all had of Curado and his lady, and their sons and their friends, words may not describe. Wherefore, my ladies, I leave it to your imagination. And that their joy might be full, God, who, when he gives most abundantly, added the glad tidings that Arigetto Capece was alive and prosperous. For, when in the best of spirits the ladies and gentlemen had sat them down to feast, and they were yet at the first course, the envoy from Sicily arrived, and among other matters reported, that no sooner had the insurrection broken out in the island, than the people hied them in hot haste to the prison where Arigetto was kept in confinement by King Charles, and dispatching the guards, brought him forth, and knowing him to be a capital enemy to King Charles, made him their captain, and under his command fell upon and massacred the French. Whereby he had won the highest place in the favour of King Peter, who had granted him restitution of all his estates and honours, so that he was now both prosperous and mighty. The envoy added that Arigetto had received him with every token of honour, had manifested the utmost delight on hearing of his lady and son, of whom no tidings had reached him since his arrest, and had sent, to bring them home, a brigantine with some gentlemen aboard, whose arrival might hourly be expected. The envoy and the good news which he brought were heartily welcome, and presently Corrado, with some of his friends, encountered the gentlemen who came from Madame Beritola and Guisfredi, and saluting them cordially, invited them to his feast, which was not yet half done. Joy unheard of was depicted on the faces of the lady, of Guisfredi, and of all the rest as they greeted them, nor did they on their part take their places at the table before, as best they might, they had conveyed to Corrado and his lady Arrighetto's greetings and grateful acknowledgments of the honour which they had conferred upon his lady and his son, and had placed Arrighetto to the utmost of his power entirely at their service. Then, turning to Messer Gasparino, of whose kindness Arrighetto surmised nothing, they said that they were very sure that, when he learned the boon which Outcast had received at his hands, he would pay him the like and an even greater tribute of gratitude. This speech ended, they feasted most joyously with the brides and bridegrooms. So passed the day, the first of many which Corrado devoted to honouring his son-in-law and his other intimates, both kinsfolk and friends. The time of festivity ended, Madame Beritola and Guisfredi and the rest felt that they must leave, so, taking Spina with them, they parted, not without many tears, from Corrado and his lady and Gasparino, and went aboard the brigantine, which, wafted by a prosperous wind, soon brought them to Sicily. At Palermo they were met by Arrighetto, who received them all, ladies and sons alike, with such cheer as it were vain to attempt to describe. There it is believed that they all lived long and happily, and in amity with God, being not unmindful of the blessings which he had conferred upon them. End of Day 2, the 6th story.